Most people don't lose money because of one big mistake. They lose it because of a small one. Repeated, quietly, unnoticed, for years. And the most dangerous part is this. It never feels like a mistake. It feels normal. It feels reasonable. It feels justified. That's why it survives. That's why it compounds. And that's why, for many people, the real financial damage is already happening long before they ever notice it. You probably think your financial situation is the result of a few key decisions, a bad investment, a missed opportunity, a wrong move at the wrong time. But that's not how most financial outcomes are created. Wealth is not shaped by isolated decisions. It's shaped by patterns, repeated behaviors, small choices that seem irrelevant in the moment, but become decisive over time. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because the pattern that affects your finances the most is usually the one you've stopped questioning, not because it works, but because it feels familiar. You don't wake up and decide to sabotage your finances. No one does. You don't consciously choose to lose long-term growth. You don't intentionally reject compounding. What actually happens is much simpler. You repeat decisions that feel harmless, decisions that don't look like mistakes, decisions that don't trigger any internal alarm. And that's exactly the problem. Because the brain doesn't flag repetition as risk. It flags novelty. It reacts to big changes, big losses, big threats. But small repeated behaviors, they become invisible. And once something becomes invisible, it becomes permanent. There's a financial error that operates exactly like this. It doesn't show up in your bank account immediately. It doesn't create stress. It doesn't force you to react. In fact, it often feels like you're doing nothing wrong. That's what makes it so effective. It hides inside normality, inside routines, inside everyday decisions that seem too small to matter. But over time, they define everything. Think about how most people evaluate their financial behavior. They look for big mistakes. They remember the obvious ones, the bad investment, the impulsive purchase, the missed opportunity. Those moments feel important. They feel like turning points. But they're not the real drivers because those events are rare. They don't happen every day. And what doesn't happen every day doesn't shape long-term outcomes. What shapes outcomes is repetition. Not what you do once, what you do consistently. And consistency doesn't come from intention. It comes from default behavior, from what feels automatic, from what requires no effort to repeat. And that's where the real problem lives. Because most financial decisions are not conscious. They're automated. You don't analyze them, you don't evaluate them, you don't even notice them, you just repeat them again and again and again until they become your financial identity. You might think your financial identity is defined by your goals, your plans, your intentions. But it's not. It's defined by your patterns, by the behaviors you repeat without thinking. Because those behaviors are the ones that actually execute, not your plans, not your intentions, your patterns. And here's the uncomfortable part. The pattern that costs you the most money is usually the one that feels the safest, the most reasonable, the most normal. Because if something felt like a mistake, you would stop, you would question it, you would interrupt the behavior. But when something feels correct, you protect it, you defend it, you repeat it without resistance. That's how the error survives. Not because it's hidden, but because it's accepted, integrated into your daily behavior, normalized to the point where it no longer triggers any doubt. And once a behavior reaches that level, it becomes extremely difficult to change, because it no longer feels like a decision. It feels like who you are. Let's make this more precise. The most expensive financial mistake is not a bad decision. It's a repeated one. A decision that happens so often that it stops being evaluated. A decision that blends into your routine. A decision that feels too small to audit. And that's exactly why it matters. Because small decisions don't stay small. They accumulate, they compound. Not always in visible ways, but always in real ones. Every repeated action creates a trajectory, a direction. And once that direction is established, it doesn't require effort to continue. It requires effort to stop. That's the part most people underestimate. They think financial damage comes from intensity, from large losses, from dramatic mistakes. But in reality, most financial damage comes from duration, from how long a behavior is allowed to continue, not how big it is, how long it survives. And the longer a pattern survives, the harder it becomes to see, because familiarity reduces awareness. What you repeat, you stop questioning. What you stop questioning, you stop seeing. And what you stop seeing, you stop controlling. This is where the real shift happens. Because the problem is not that people make mistakes. Everyone does. The problem is that they don't detect the ones that repeat. They audit the obvious, they ignore the constant, they focus on events, they ignore patterns. And patterns are what define outcomes. If a financial mistake only happened once, it wouldn't matter. It would be irrelevant. A small deviation, a temporary loss. But when that same mistake happens hundreds of times, over years, it stops being a mistake, it becomes a system that produces predictable results. And here's the most important part. You don't experience that system as a system. You experience it as normal life, as routine, as this is just how things are, which means you don't feel the need to change it, because nothing feels broken, nothing feels urgent, nothing feels wrong enough, and that's exactly how the error continues. Not because it's powerful, but because it's invisible. Not because it's complex, but because it's repeated. And not because you don't care about your finances, but because the pattern never feels like the problem. This is the first layer of the pattern, and most people never get past it, because recognizing repetition requires stepping outside of it. And that's something the brain resists, because repetition feels safe, predictable, effortless, and anything that challenges that feels uncomfortable, even if it's correct. What makes this pattern dangerous is not just that it repeats, it's that it produces a financial consequence that feels delayed, almost disconnected. You make a decision today, nothing happens. You repeat it tomorrow, still nothing. A week passes, a month, even a year, and everything still feels fine. No visible damage, no immediate loss, no signal telling you to stop, which creates a powerful illusion. The illusion that the behavior is harmless. But financial systems don't operate on immediate feedback. They operate on accumulation, on delayed consequences, on compounding effects that only become visible after enough time has passed. And by the time the effect becomes visible, the behavior that created it is already deeply ingrained. This is where most people miscalculate. They expect financial mistakes to feel expensive immediately, to hurt, to trigger some kind of reaction, but the most expensive behaviors don't feel expensive at all. They feel neutral, even comfortable, because their cost is not immediate, it's cumulative. Let's break that down. Every time you repeat a small financial decision, you are not just spending money. You are defining a trajectory, a direction for your capital, a direction for your future options. And that direction doesn't change unless the behavior changes, not because you want it to, not because you plan to, but because behavior is what executes, not intention. If a decision costs you $10 once, it's irrelevant. If it costs you $10 every day for years, it becomes a system, not because of the amount, but because of the repetition. Because repetition turns small numbers into large outcomes, not through intensity, but through time. This is the part most people underestimate. Time amplifies behavior, not intentions, not goals, behavior. Whatever you repeat consistently gets multiplied by time. And time is not neutral. It doesn't wait for you to correct the pattern, it accelerates it. So, when a behavior goes unexamined, it doesn't stay stable. It grows, quietly, predictably, relentlessly. And by the time you notice the effect, you are no longer dealing with a small decision. You are dealing with years of accumulated direction. Now here's where it becomes even more uncomfortable, because the real cost of the pattern is not what you lose. It's what you never build, the opportunities that never compound, the capital that never grows, the returns that never exist. Because the money, was never in the right place long enough to generate them. This is what makes the error so deceptive. You don't see a loss, you see stability, you see normality, you see a financial life that doesn't feel broken. But what you don't see is the alternative path that never happened. And that invisible path is where the real cost lives, because wealth is not just about avoiding losses, it's about capturing growth. And growth requires consistency. It requires capital staying in the right direction, long enough to compound. And every time your behavior interrupts that process, you are not just making a small mistake, you are breaking a long-term trajectory. But again, you don't feel that in the moment. You don't feel the compounding you lost. You don't feel the years of growth that never happened. Because absence doesn't create pain, only presence does. And this is the second layer of the pattern. The cost is invisible because it never materializes in front of you. It disappears before it even has the chance to exist. So from your perspective, nothing is wrong. You're not losing money dramatically. You're not making catastrophic errors. You're just operating normally. But normal does not mean optimal. And in financial systems, normal is often the most expensive position, because normal behavior is rarely designed for growth. It's designed for comfort, for short-term stability, for predictability. And those qualities feel safe, but they come with a hidden trade-off. They limit exposure to long-term upside. They reduce the probability of meaningful accumulation. They keep your financial trajectory flat, and a flat trajectory doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like maintenance, like stability, like control. But over a long enough timeline, flat is not neutral, flat is erosion. Because while your behavior stays the same, the system around you continues to move. Inflation moves, opportunities move, markets move, time moves. And if your behavior doesn't adapt, you are not staying in the same place. You are falling behind. But again, you don't feel that immediately because the difference between where you are and where you could have been takes years to become visible. And by the time it does, the pattern is no longer optional. It's structural. This is why most people only recognize the problem too late. Not because they are incapable of understanding it, but because the system doesn't give early feedback. It allows the behavior to continue, to stabilize, to normalize, until it becomes part of identity. At that point, changing the behavior is no longer just a financial adjustment. It's a psychological one, because you're not just modifying a decision, you're challenging something that feels like how you operate. And that creates resistance, not logical resistance, emotional resistance, because the brain protects what feels familiar, even if it's expensive. So instead of questioning the pattern, people justify it. They rationalize it. They explain it in ways that make it feel acceptable. They say things like, "It's not that much, I'll adjust later. This doesn't really affect anything." And each one of those statements does the same thing. It protects the repetition. Because once a behavior is justified, it no longer needs to be examined. It becomes self-sustaining. It continues without friction, without interruption, without awareness. And that's when it becomes dangerous, because now the pattern is not just repeated, it's defended, integrated, stabilized. And at that point, you're no longer making a series of small decisions. You're operating a system that produces the same outcome over and over again. And here's the critical insight. The system doesn't care what you want. It doesn't respond to your goals. It doesn't adjust to your intentions. It only follows your behavior, exactly as it is, not as you imagine it, not as you describe it, as you actually execute it, which means if the behavior doesn't change, the outcome doesn't change. Not because of external conditions, not because of bad luck, but because the system is working exactly as designed. And this is where the narrative usually breaks, because most people at this point still believe the solution is to make better decisions, to try harder, to be more disciplined, to pay more attention. But that approach assumes the problem is awareness. It's not. The problem is repetition, and repetition does not change with intention. It changes with structure. You can know exactly what you should do financially and still repeat the same pattern. You can understand compounding. You can understand investing. You can understand long-term strategy, and still execute something completely different, because knowledge does not interrupt automatic behavior. Only intervention does. This is the second layer most people never see. They think their financial problem is a lack of information. But the real issue is that their current behavior is perfectly aligned with their current results, not their desired results, their actual ones, which leads to an uncomfortable conclusion. You are not stuck financially because you don't know what to do. You are stuck because your repeated behavior is producing exactly what it's designed to produce. Nothing more, nothing less. That's why change feels so difficult. Because you're not trying to fix a mistake. You're trying to interrupt a system that has been running for years. A system that feels normal. A system that doesn't require effort to continue, but requires effort to stop. And the brain doesn't like that. Because stopping a pattern creates friction. It creates uncertainty. It creates discomfort. And the brain interprets discomfort as risk, even when the real risk is staying exactly where you are. So what happens? You delay the change. You tell yourself you'll adjust later. You wait for the right moment. A moment with more clarity, more motivation, more certainty. But that moment never comes, because the system you're operating is designed to avoid it. And while you wait, the pattern continues, quietly, efficiently, without resistance, producing the same outcome, again and again. This is the real financial trap. Not ignorance, not lack of opportunity, not even lack of discipline, but unexamined repetition. Behavior that feels too small to matter, repeated too many times to ignore. And here's the part most people avoid. Because it removes the last layer of external explanation. The system is not happening to you. You are maintaining it. Every day, with every repeated decision, with every behavior that goes unquestioned, not intentionally, but consistently. And consistency is what defines financial outcomes. Not effort, not intensity, consistency. So when someone says, "I don't understand why I'm not progressing financially," the answer is usually not hidden in a complex strategy. It's visible in their daily behavior, in the decisions they repeat without noticing, in the patterns they've normalized. And once you see it, the narrative changes. Because now the problem is no longer abstract. It's not about the market. It's not about income. It's not about timing. It's about pattern. And patterns are predictable. They don't surprise you. They don't suddenly change. They continue until something interrupts them. Which means the real question is not, what should I do? It's, what am I repeating? Because that answer explains everything. It explains your current position. It explains your trajectory. It explains why time is either working for you or against you. And most importantly, it reveals something people rarely want to admit. The biggest financial mistake is not a single decision you regret. It's the one you never questioned, the one you repeated so many times that it stopped feeling like a decision at all. That's the mistake that compounds. That's the mistake that shapes outcomes. That's the mistake that builds a financial life without you ever consciously choosing it. And by the time most people realize it and they don't find a dramatic error, they find a pattern, one that has been there the entire time, quiet, consistent, unchallenged. That's the cost, not the money you lost, but the years the pattern was allowed to run.